Hello and welcome to Fade to PB8. In this episode, we will be coloring in Kermit having a beer at the bar. I'll go through step by step what I do, talk about some of my strategy, and talk about also some things I might have done a little bit differently, some areas I kind of messed up. I'm going to speed it up about 16 times and voice it over because it took me about 5.5 hours. So I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think of the comments, and I will see you on the other side. Thank you. Now, first, I want to talk about kind of my goal and how I developed a strategy to accomplish that goal. I wanted to create a drawing with Kermit in a bar that's kind of like a dimly lit bar that has two light sources in the picture itself. So it's got this yellow light chandelier, and then it's got this red neon sign to the right. And so I started with those because those colors are going to help me establish all the background, all the other colors throughout the drawing. So I started off with those. Now the markers that I use for those lights, I use time and time again. I'm going to come back and I'm going to highlight areas of Kermit, of the walls, of different Muppets, using those yellows and those reds. And that's going to help me achieve the colors that I want. Now, when I go into this, I'm not really, I don't really know exactly what the final result is going to look like. But I know I want a fairly dark image, and the safest way, my approach is always to kind of start light and end dark. When you start light, you can always go darker. It's very safe because you can just go over with a darker marker. And it kind of like, by putting down a lighter marker, it kind of helps mold the image into what you want eventually, without you taking a big risk of trying to go for that final marker, just trying to go to the straight end of color. Now, if you look at the final image, there are probably hundreds of different colors, thousands of tones. I'm mixing the colors quite a bit. And in my strategy, I go over many, many times. I use 60-pound paper. I find that to be more effective than 20-pound paper, especially for my strategy, where I kind of go over, I'll probably go over most parts of the drawing, probably between 5 and maybe even 15 times, getting a little bit darker and darker each time I go. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting with the background, and I'm trying to establish just how dark and how much contrast and just the environment for Kermit. If I started with Kermit right away, I would probably end up with like a frog that's too brightly lit and looks like he's out of the Muppet Show. But no, I want something he's a little bit darker and he's got the reflections of the lights going. So I save the more important parts for last, and I start with the background. Like I said, it kind of helps establish like how dark I want things to go, how much contrast there's going to be. But I also like to start with the background just because it's not really a place that's going to grab your attention. When you show these images, your drawings to friends and stuff, they'll probably look at them for maybe like 5 to 10 seconds. And for the majority of that time, they're probably going to be looking at Kermit. They might look at the bottles on the wall, but they're really not going to be looking at the ceiling or maybe like the bar itself. But it's really important that you nail those colors down, just because if anything is wrong and it stands out, it will ruin the entire image. So when I do this bar, notice how I'm starting with these lighter browns, and I'm kind of mixing them all together. I'm not just using one marker and going one marker that's light, then a second marker over everything that's a little bit darker, then a third marker that's a little bit darker. I'm kind of scattering them around a little bit. I'm using browns that are there's like a mahogany one. There's ones with like a bit of like potato color. And I'm kind of mixing them all together, like sporadically. I'm trying to get an uneven distribution of color. I want it to be close. I want all the color to be close, but I don't want it to be monotone. So I go over this area with the bar in the front of the bar many times with pretty much all those markers that you see on my palette. And I just progressively get a little bit darker and darker. I don't push super hard into the paper, but for a 60-pound paper, you really do have to go over it probably 2 or 3 times to get the final result. If you're using regular printer paper, you can probably go over it once, maybe twice. But with this thicker paper and my strategy involved, I do end up using a little bit more ink. So just beware that if you use my strategy, you will use a little bit more ink. But I think the end result is worth it. And also, I think it's worth it starting light and finishing dark because it's a lower risk. I spent probably about 5, maybe even 6 hours on this, and I want a low risk strategy. I'm willing to use a little bit more ink if it means I'm less likely to mess up, less likely to make a mistake, or if I make a mistake, it's easier to correct. And by using more ink, it's easier to correct mistakes. Because what you can do is when the paper gets wet, with each layer you put down with a marker and a new marker, it gets slightly more damp, more wet, and it's actually easier to go back and make corrections while the paper is wet. Now, we don't want to oversaturate the paper. We'll get more into that later because that is something I do mess up a little bit on, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, it's really important that you stay consistent. Okay, if I make a mistake somewhere, let's say I grab a marker that has slightly too much red for the background and I don't like it, I have to stay consistent. I have to keep using that. And then I can go back and try to correct it with the correct marker. If I mess up just one little area with a marker that's too red and I say I'm just going to try to fix this here, well, you know what? It might not be consistent with other parts of the drawing. So it's really important that if you make a mistake somewhere, you stay consistent, you stick with that mistake, carry it through the whole section that you're working on. Let's say you're working on the entire bar section, carry it through, and make sure that you just work with it. Just like in the words of Bob Ross, we have happy accidents, and you kind of have to work with what you got. And sometimes you can really turn it into something nice. Now, these bottles were quite a bit of fun. What I loved about it was there are just so many different color combinations that you could do. So I have a lot of greens and grays and blues and browns. And I kind of mix them all together. Now, I want the reflection of that light, that yellow light, on the bottle. So I actually kind of went in and put the reflection in ahead of time. And I think that's okay because that yellow reflection color is pretty light. And we'll just end up going over with the darker marker. You can always go darker, whether the ink is dry or the ink is wet. You can always go darker. You can kind of go lighter. You can go a little bit lighter. It's a little bit easier, a lot easier if the ink is still wet. So just make sure that, just make sure that if you want to go a little bit lighter, you can either use like the blender marker, which is also known as the eraser, which is pretty much just like a colorless marker, which behaves a little bit differently. Or you can use a lighter marker that you've already used and kind of blend things together and just kind of dig into the paper a little bit and just go over and over and over. And with that lighter marker, it'll actually line things up. It's a little bit easier to do with the chisel tip to line things up, but you got to be careful with the chisel tip because you can damage the paper, which I do a little bit later. For these bottles, I kind of made each one unique, but then they all kind of stand out. They don't exactly all go together with the background and with the lighting and everything. So what I did was I grabbed that yellow marker. I let it all dry just a little bit. I grabbed that yellow marker and I just went over everything. And it kind of brought it all together. It gave it a nice tone. But at the same time, each bottle still looks unique. Each bottle still looks individual. You'll notice that I'm putting down this pretty bright red on the sign right here. But that paper is actually quite wet. So I can go in with a red that is way too bright. As long as it's on wet ink, I'm able to work it in and come back in with my very light red and just fade away that brightness to just get a soft red glow. And that was my goal there for the sign. And I do this a lot. I'll saturate an area, not completely, but I'll get an area wet, probably go over 3 or 4 times. I'll add the yellow orangish marker or the reddish marker to show kind of like a glowing or like a reflection. And then I'll go back to the original color and kind of work it back in. So I end up like blending purple with the orange. And I end up blending Kermit's face, which is green, with the red. And you can do this, and that red won't dominate as long as your ink is pretty wet. Now, it's really important to keep in mind like where people's attention is going to be drawn to. Now, I probably went a little too quickly on these people in the background.
I just used some generic colors, and maybe I went a little bit too quick. And what happens if you're working in a really small area and you kind of go layer after layer after layer is the paper gets saturated. It can start to kind of bleed through the lines, and it can actually warp the paper, even damage the paper. Now, in some areas, this is an AI generated image. It's great fun coming up with your own images. But the AI is really good, but it's not perfect. And there's sometimes some areas that you're kind of like, oh, what exactly is that? Well, for the girl like in the purple kind of to the right of Kermit, I wasn't really sure what was going on around her chest area. So I just made it really dark. And I know the attention's not going to be drawn there. And what's nice about going dark, especially with clothing, is that you can just kind of say, hey, either it's really shadowy or she's just wearing dark clothes. And it kind of makes those black lines kind of hide away, and you just don't notice it. No one's going to look close enough at your image to really nitpick those little things like, oh, this line is a little bit off, something's wrong. It's all about kind of the first impression and just your, what you're feeling after just a few seconds of looking at it. And does it feel authentic? So matching the colors is really important, and giving everything kind of like this yellowish, orangish, reddish tone. I think was kind of my goal. Each Muppet is unique. What's kind of fun about the Muppets is you can kind of choose whatever colors you would like. Anything between like a peach and an orangish color for the skin. But notice how I put down the highlights first, and that's the kind of bring things to life. It's kind of a reminder to me, hey, these are the areas we're going to be working on. And I did put them down way ahead of time. They are going to dry completely. So when I come back to do like Kermit, for example, his face, I'm going to end up going back over that orange spot with the same orange marker. And I'm going to go over the red spot with the same red marker. When I let the ink dry like that, it won't be able to blend. But I'm okay doing it as long as like I'm using like a very, very light color that I know I'm going to end up going over with like a darker color. Now, if it were like a dark red or a dark orange, I would not put it down and let it dry first. I would definitely work with the wet ink. But when you're working with a pastelish type of color, it's okay to let it dry a bit because you can just go over it pretty easily. So notice how when I'm doing this guy's face and his nose, I'm kind of jumping back and forth between the skin color or the clothing color, and then I'm jumping back into the orangish color and the reddish color, and I keep working those highlights, working the skin, working the highlights, and I'm blending it all together. And I probably go over it, 10 or 15 times before I'm satisfied. Now, for marker selection, I use Ohuhu for kind of like normal colors and colored grays, like a green gray or a blue gray. But for warm grays and natural grays, I use Copic markers. I find their gradients a lot easier to work with, and I think they just blend very, very well. And you can combine the two together. The majority of this is Ohuhu markers, but for that Muppet I'm working on his face, I did use a warm gray from a Copic, and they blend together just fine. You should experiment a bit. I encourage you to, if you're going to print off one of these, print off a second one to practice on. Try some things differently. Try to see how many layers you can put down and change the color to a darker one. See if you can go lighter. See how the ink reacts if it's fresh and it's very, very wet, or if it's slightly damp, or if it's completely dry. You need to experiment and kind of just get to know your markers pretty well. So I'm coming up on the Muppet on the left, the lady on the left. I do her kind of like in a pinkish reddish color, and that's kind of where I screw up. I end up going over her too many times too quickly, and the ink starts to bleed, and I start to damage the paper. And what I really should have done is maybe just like 3 to 5 layers between her face, her hair, and her clothes. Get it close to what I want, but be patient. Let the ink dry a little bit, and then come back and go over it again. Give it 3, 4, 5 minutes. Come back, let it dry. Otherwise, you will damage the paper, especially if you're using that chisel tip and trying to kind of like dig into like a very small area. you can really damage the paper. And if you look at my end result, the paper's kind of warped and it is damaged just slightly. So that's my biggest mistake in this drawing. I think I could have also done a better job with the girl picking out the palette ahead of time. I ended up with kind of like this. She ends up a little bit too red for my liking, and I wish I had planned ahead a little bit more because those red colors are kind of hard to go lighter and kind of hard to change back to like a peach color, for example. So, you just gotta be patient. At this point in the drawing, I was very fatigued. I'd probably been working on it for 4 or 5 hours or something, and I started to get a little careless. So I just had to be a little more careful. I actually stepped away for a while, let the ink dry, and then I came back and did Kermit. Notice how I'm jumping between the greens and back into the oranges and the reds. It's how I'm just kind of fading everything together. I'm bringing all the colors together with that orange and that red, and it's just like the opposite of a shadow. If the area is closest to the red light, it gets a touch of red. If it's closest to the orange light, it gets a touch of orange. Overall, I'm actually very, very happy with how this turned out. I know this tutorial is pretty brief, and there's only so much detail I can go into without making a 4-hour long video. The takeaway from this is just plan ahead, be smart, don't be afraid to experiment a little bit. It's fun to try to do reflections and shadows, things like that, but you gotta be willing to experiment. Just don't hesitate to try something new. That's how you get better, is trying something new. And I'm still learning myself, and I would really love to hear anything you have to say in the comments, and your feedback is really going to help a lot. So I really, really appreciate you watching me, and we'll see you in the next video. Just doing some final touches here.